Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on trends in educational publishing. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and I'm pleased to be able to welcome you to today's webinar, which features a special presentation of the National Association of College Stores, or NACS, Annual Student Watch Report. It covers both student attitudes and behaviors toward course materials. The webinar will also feature information regarding current trends in the U.S. K-12 and higher education, federal and state funding levels, and the reopening of colleges and schools this fall. We have three expert speakers, Richard Hershman, who's Vice President of Government Relations at NACS, Brittany Conley, who's a research analyst at On-Campus Research, which is the research division of NACS. Brittany we were fortunate to have Brittany present this study a year ago, and we're glad to have her back. Later in this conversation today, Jay Diskey, who's Principal of Diskey Public Affairs and formerly Executive Director of the Association of American Publishers Education Division, will join us to talk about some of the macro data that I mentioned a moment ago. We're going to start with a presentation of the Student Watch survey from Brittany. So with great thanks for having you today, we'll turn it over to Brittany Conley.
Thanks so much, Brian. So as Brian just said, essentially my part of the presentation is going to go over the Student Watch findings. This is kind of some of the things we're going to cover. Brian kind of already said that. Before I talk about the data though, just to kind of give anyone an idea what Student Watch is who maybe isn't as familiar with it, On-Campus Research, which is the research arm of NACS, monitors and explores trends in course content. So we really cover a wide range of topics relating to students and faculty in higher education. Specifically, the Student Watch study focuses on the Student Watch side, while our counterpart Faculty Watch, more focuses on the faculty side of things. But the main objective of Student Watch is to evaluate student attitudes and behaviors towards course materials, and we're going to go over some of that data today. So the 2020 study, this is a yearly study. It's conducted once a year now. The 2021 was conducted across 35 2- and 4-year institutions. Those are both in the US and Canada. And we received just over 14,000 responses. So that's students all across the nation at 35 different higher education institutions. And we're able to make such a large survey and survey so many students thanks to the NACS Foundation, which supports the Student Watch study. But essentially, that's all you really need to know about the survey overall. It's sent out. We partner with the institutions and with college stores to send out that survey, and it's sent out via email, and the students respond, and then we're able to analyze all that data and put together these findings for presentations like this. So I'll start out with spending on course materials. That's kind of the number everybody wants to talk about every year. That's probably what we get quoted the most on as far as sharing out the data. So before we talk about actual dollar amounts, we have to look at how many course materials were actually obtained by students, and that's kind of what's covered here. So students took 8.8 total courses throughout the academic year. That's averaged out whether the campus was on semesters or quarters. Averaged out, it averaged about 8.8 courses for that year. And across those courses, 7.7 required materials were obtained during that year. That's specifically required materials. We differentiate between required and recommended. So did the professor say, this material is required in order to be, to take part in this class, or was it additional materials that students could have the option to obtain or not? And if we include those recommended materials in, the total number of materials bumps up to 9.1 total materials. So depending on if you want to look at just required or if you want to look at required and recommended, you're looking at about 7.7 or 9.1 total materials obtained throughout the year. And the spending on that, so for the 2019-2020 academic year, we saw college students spend an average of about $413 on required course materials. And we track this number every year so that we're not just giving you, one snapshot and don't necessarily have context for it. We track that number each year. And so looking back just 1 year before, that's about in line with what we saw the previous year. So in the 2018-2019 academic year, we saw students spend $415. So those are essentially even, just a slight decrease. But if we really go back and look even just 10 years back, that number was as high as $701. So while short-term year to year, we've seen it be about the same. If we go back, we see that that decrease is extremely significant, decreasing down from $701. But I don't just want to talk about overall spend, because we kind of have to talk about some more context to this. And that's that we also look at things like spend per course. So in the case of the 2019-2020 academic year, we said, students were taking 8.8 courses. That was actually higher than they had taken the year before. So if we look at that average spend per course, we see that decrease in spending actually becomes more significant, where students spend an average spend per course of $47, whereas last year that was $50. So overall, it does look kind of even, but you have to take into account that students took more courses this semester, meaning that average spend per course is actually down. And this one right here, this is that overall number. So when I reported that 413 for overall spend, if we look at that on a graph of each year we've tracked it, you can really see both how significant and, for the most part, how consistent that decline has been throughout the years. And meanwhile, this is a very similar graph, only this time we're looking at that spending per course. So all we do is take the overall spend and divide it by number of courses students were taking. And you can see that the spending decrease is actually still consistent throughout this. It didn't necessarily even steady off this year. So when we're looking at spending per course, that continued to decline this year as it has in the past few years. Now in Student Watch, because we have such a large group of students, one of the benefits of having so many students participate is we can really break down some of those numbers into smaller groups and look at how much each group spent. And when we look at student spending, there's some big differences based on who the student is, based on some different categories essentially. And some of those big ones are institution type. So is the student at a 2-year school or a 4-year school? You can see those numbers here at the left. Students at a 2-year school spent about $472 on average, whereas those students at the 4-year school spent less at about $369 on average throughout the year. Same thing goes for year in school. If we look at students just by year in school, regardless of if they're at a 2-year or 4-year institution, we see that a lot of that spending is kind of higher for those first couple years. So especially first and second year, that number is, mid 400s or $430, whereas it will start to decrease, especially around that 3rd year. And you can see 4th and 5th year students spend as low as $362 on course materials per the year. Now, to kind of move on from just talking about spending, we're going to look at how students acquired materials. So, of course, the two main methods of obtaining materials are either purchasing or renting. And we often compare these two and kind of look at, both trending information on where they're going, as well as just comparing one to the other. And for the past term, so in this case, we're actually just looking at spring, 80% of students said that they had purchased at least one material, and that was down slightly from 83% the year before. So just a note here, that's the number of students who obtained at least one. That's not percentage of materials. It's just, did a student purchase a material, yes or no? And we see that 80% of students said yes, they had purchased at least one. That is a slight decrease from the year before. That's 3% difference from the year before. 80% is certainly lower than we've seen for a number of years. If you look back on this graph, the lowest other option was 82%. So a slightly lower number of students were purchasing this year than we're traditionally used to seeing. Meanwhile, on the rental side of things, 44% of students had rented at least one course material this spring. And that number is much more consistent with previous years if we're looking back at some of that trending data. This one is also looking at materials acquisition, except now we're looking at the format of the material. So whether the material was purchased or rented, it doesn't matter. We combined those two and looked at the percent of units that was either new print, used print, or digital materials. And in this case, we're comparing it to just 1 year ago. So you can see that probably the biggest shift in this exists in the used print and digital. So used print had represented 47% of paid materials just 1 year ago, and now that's down to 39%. So if you remember, if we look at percentage of students paying on this slide, pretty consistent numbers year to year, but when we're looking at formats, we're seeing larger changes. So less students are turning to used prints, or at least less students are paying for used print materials, whereas you know, a number of students are increasingly paying for digital materials. Kind of in the middle of that is new print that didn't really see any change. That could have to do with, you know, certain topics where students have to buy the new print material. So obviously it depends on the topic the material covers, but some of those ones that have to be updated every year, the students, you know, are kind of supposed to buy the new print. That's what's used in the class. Whereas some of those other courses where students can use older materials, they have a little bit more options and can turn to use print. So it's really this format area where we're seeing more changes as opposed to our students printing or renting, purchasing or renting, where we're not seeing as many changes. And these are two other methods. So obviously purchasing and renting are the two main ways of obtaining materials, but there's also borrowing materials as well as free download of materials. And one area that's really seen regular growth from year to year is the percentage of students who are downloading materials for free. And I do want to clarify that downloading for free can mean a number of different things. In our case, we kind of want to you know, measure all of those together. So in this case, free downloading means any free download of a material. That means whether it was legal or possibly illegally obtained. We have in past years asked students if they did obtain materials illegally, and we don't think that represents a large portion of those free downloads. But looking at free downloads overall, you can see that that has increased every single year since 2015 when it first started to kind of become one of the main methods. And now it's all the way up to 26% of students. So more than 1 in 4 students have downloaded at least one non-paid for material this past spring term.
Go ahead. Sorry, I just wanted to add, we also think that the growth of the use of open educational resources is an element of this growth of free downloads. So as more OER is being used and adopted by faculty, either with commercial materials or in substitute of, that's also accounting for the free acquisition increases.
Absolutely.
Sorry about that.
You're good. Thanks for adding that. And then there's not really anything to cover for borrowing. I think that it's pretty self-explanatory when we look at the orange line here. That's kind of bounced around within about 11 to 14% of students. Really, if we're looking at those alternative acquisition methods, it's free downloads where we see that increase. And like Rich said, many of that might be attributed to those open educational resource downloads that students are increasingly being able to use. Free materials obtained per student. So this means free materials whether they were downloaded or obtained any other way. And this is an average of the actual unit as opposed to % of students. So this year, the average students obtained 0.73 free materials in spring 2020. So essentially more than half a unit per student was obtained for free. Looking back, this is kind of, I would say, like a bit of an inconsistent increase, but still certainly an increase. And especially this varies sometimes between fall and spring. But our main takeaway from here is that we are seeing an increase, like Rich said, in both the percentage of students downloading free materials, but also the number of free materials obtained overall, whether it was downloaded or not. Materials preference. So everything we've talked about so far has kind of been, you know, what students actually did obtain or how much they actually did spend. We know that students don't always have a perfect choice in those options. You know, they may receive a textbook that had to be print format. Maybe it wasn't available digitally, or maybe it was a digital material and it wasn't available over print. In this case, we're just asking student what their preference is, regardless of what they actually obtained or not. It's what they actually would prefer to obtain. And we asked this a couple different ways, and we kind of look at the numbers a couple different ways. So what we're looking at here is all formats. So in this case, I've combined nothing to make this graph. We're just looking at each individual format. And we see that 22% of students preferred a strictly print textbook, whereas 26% of students preferred a print textbook with some kind of additional digital component. So that could be, you know, anything from adaptive learning content to maybe, you know, some of the practice quizzes are available online. Essentially any kind of print textbook with some kind of digital content added on. Whereas if we look at strictly digital textbooks, about 11% of students prefer those. That's kind of more your traditional just PDF download. Whereas 10% of students are preferring a digital book with additional digital content, again, whether that's tests or whether that's, you know, anything that is available to add on via different digital methods. We do combine these so that we can kind of compare print overall compared to digital overall. And when we combine these, about half of students preferred some type of print, even if it was print with additional digital components, whereas 21% of students prefer some type of digital materials. And then also noteworthy here is a high percentage of students, technically the highest single category, said it depends on the course. And that just goes to show you how much like preference changes, right? So not only can one student prefer something different than another student, a single student can actually prefer something different for maybe that freshman intro class than maybe they would, you know, a class in their actual field of study, maybe a book they want to keep more, or a book they feel like they're really going to have to highlight through more, or something like that. It's surprising to see kind of an other option like depends on course be so high. So we certainly know that there's something important happening here. And format preference over time, again, I don't just want to give you a snapshot of any one of these numbers right off the bat, you know, for this year. What we want to do is look at how this has changed so we know what direction it's trending for in the future. This one, it's pretty clear here. We have seen print preference decline through the years. At its highest in about 2016, 69% of students had preferred some type of print. So that kind of puts in context that 48%. That is lower than it had been. It's only been the last 2, I would say, years that we've actually seen that really start to decline. I think as early as 2016, we were already hearing rumblings of, you know, the decline of print, but we hadn't really seen student preference follow that. Now we are starting to see it decline some. But again, if you look just compared to last year, it actually didn't change compared to 1 year. It stayed consistent last year. So in 2020, students didn't prefer print at a lower rate than they did the year before. Meanwhile, on the digital side, it's been a very slow increase, but we are finally seeing that preference for digital slowly increase among students, with that 21% being double what it even was back in 2016. Acquisition source, so now we're looking at where students actually went to purchase their materials. And I'm going to have this split up into both purchasing and renting so we can kind of compare the differences here. And for the market share of purchase units, this is going to be the actual percentage of units that was obtained per source. We see that a little more than half of materials are purchased through the campus store. The second leading source is Amazon. Not too surprising there, right? We always kind of talk about Amazon being another main source that students turn to. And this year we also saw publisher be a little bit higher than we're normally used to. So 10%, meaning 1 in every 10 units was obtained directly through a publisher this year. Whereas some of the other options like Chegg or just from another student showed up pretty small this year at about 2%. Meanwhile, on the rental side, we're seeing the market be a lot closer in terms of competition between other sources. So the campus store is again the #1 place that students are renting units. You know, 40% of students did, or sorry, 40% of units were rented from the campus store. Whereas in this case, Amazon is a whole lot closer with 31% of units being rented through Amazon. Chegg, obviously a much bigger player in the rental market than it is the publisher or than the purchase market. And then we also have publisher here. Again, it's going to be lower than in the purchase side. So 5% of rental units were rented through a publisher. And then looking at peer and other, we have about 2 and 6%. So really just the flip back ones. Looking at these two, you can really see how much closer the market share is in terms of rentals than when we look at purchasing, where much more of the purchase units are purchased through the campus store.
Brittany, one quick thing I just want to add a little more flavor to that is that we have today probably over a third, maybe closer to 40% of college bookstores are marketplaces. Like Amazon is not only a retailer but a marketplace, as is eBay. So more than 1,000 college stores in the country offer marketplace options for students to go on their site and then source from various vendors, whether those be publishers, Amazon, Chegg, other competitors in the online marketplace. So the stores continue to be a really central starting point and a reliable starting point for the marketplace for students. But the stores are presenting many options to the students beyond just what the store is able to stock and provide. just as Amazon does with their marketplace, third-party providers.
We've also kind of tried to capture before something like that. And unfortunately, one of the limitations kind of a survey is usually if a student sees, if they're on the campus store website and it maybe can redirect and obtain their materials from somewhere else. One of the kind of pitfalls of asking students these questions and just reporting on what students report is we just know what the student thinks they're purchasing from. So Amazon is a great example of how they have the marketplace. And a student might not know if they're necessarily purchasing from Amazon or if they're purchasing from Amazon Marketplace and actually buying from another seller. We see that we kind of have to end up grouping those together. But as Rich said, there's some differences there on where students are actually obtaining and who's able, like the campus store, to direct them to some other sources. And this is the timeline. So there's a couple different ways we can talk about this, but this is talking about when students acquire their materials. And we see that students continue to delay when they acquire materials. About 29% of students had none of their materials the first day of class, which is about the same proportion of students who had all of their materials on the first day of class. So on the left-hand side, we see all materials first day of class and how it has declined throughout the years. And on the right side, we have students who obtain no materials by the first day of class and how it has increased through the years. But I know something that Rich would definitely want me to mention in this is, of course, this is asking first day, and a student doesn't necessarily need those materials the first day. We also, in different years and in different ways, have measured first week. So do students obtain their materials by the end of the first week? And we see that students are more likely to have obtained their materials after that first week of courses. But no matter how we're looking at it, whether it's first day or first week, we still see that there is a delay in students buying materials, and that each year we see less and less students having all of their materials, whether it's the first day or the first week. And each year we see more and more students have no materials the first day or the first week as each year goes on. And then not obtaining materials. So this is about those students who a material is required for their course and they choose not to obtain it or are unable to obtain it, one or the other. And 28% of students skipped acquiring at least one of their materials during the year. Again, this is year long, so that could either be 2 semesters, maybe 4 quarters. So about 1 in 4 students skip at least one material. And that is up slightly from the 25% we saw the first year. But if we're actually looking at the number of materials as opposed to the number of students, we see that about 8% of assigned materials are not obtained by students. So when we compare those, 28% of students and 8% of materials, that means that while there are kind of a high number of students skipping at least one material, it's likely they're only skipping one or a few materials because the percentage of skipped materials ends up being somewhat low at 8%. And we talked to students about why this is, what was their reason for not obtaining or skipping those materials. And it's no surprise that price or being too expensive was, the #1 option that students are reporting. I think that that's all what we're kind of used to hearing when we talk about course materials, especially not obtaining course materials. But what's really interesting about this data is, yes, that price is #1, but if we look at the #2 and the #3 and the #4 options, so the next 3 options, they all have to do with either thinking the material is unnecessary or even being told by someone else that is unnecessary. We've seen through a number of different measures that students are increasingly kind of weary that just because a material is required, that means it's actually necessary for the class. So that's another huge part of why students skip obtaining materials. It's that they think they don't need those materials. And meanwhile, this is kind of an interesting slide to transition to after saying, some students think a material isn't necessary. But if we actually talk to students and talk about them of, do they value materials? Where do they find value in materials? We see that students actually do respond fairly positive when asked about the materials themselves, kind of regardless of price. We kind of took price out of the equation. And in this case, we saw that 69% of students said they were satisfied with the materials. In fact, only 1 in 10, or about 11% of students, said that they were dissatisfied with the quality of their materials. And that's what we're looking down here below, with the green being either extremely satisfied or somewhat satisfied, and the red being the dissatisfied numbers. So as far as quality of materials, although students obviously have, their own issues they would like to bring up about price, if we actually talk about quality, students are pretty satisfied with quality. And we also talk to students, did they learn from the materials? That's essentially the, main point of course materials. That's their main goal. And we see that students, about 80% said they learned at least a moderate or more amount from course materials. And that's about on par with even doing projects. It's actually slightly higher than what students report they learn through doing projects. Of course, it's less than class lectures, which about 90% of students said they learned at least a moderate amount from. But really, course materials is right on par with both of those things, class lectures and doing projects. So to kind of summarize some of those main Student Watch findings, of course, the spending number, that's the big one. Students spent about $413 on course materials for the academic year. And when we break down that per course, it breaks down to about $47 per course, which is down $3 from $50 the previous year. So $3, across each course. We see that spending per course did decline pretty consistently than it has the past few years. When we're talking about format, our next bullet here is that digital format is growing, both in terms of paid for units. So that was, when we looked at format of units, as well as free downloads, much of that possibly driven by, open educational resources on the free side. And then students are satisfied with the quality of their course materials. They even say that they learn at minimum a moderate amount from their materials. We know students have, issues with price, but they are actually satisfied. I think we don't talk too much about the good things with course materials while we focus a lot about price and some of the more negative things. But as far as the actual materials, students are satisfied with the quality of them, and they do say they learn from them. So that's kind of more of the positive side of course materials that doesn't get talked about quite as much. And then, of course, to keep everything relevant with today, we want to talk about COVID-19 and campus stores. And I think Rich has a good little summary here to talk about some of that.
Thanks, Brittany. So I've been asked to kind of highlight a few things of what's going on with COVID, and we could probably spend days on this, and everything changes the next day. But before I do, I wanted to say how much impressed I've been with the community, and I mean by community, I mean college bookstores, I mean publishers, vendors that support a lot of the infrastructure, whether that be tied specifically to course materials or other areas. And it's really been the donations, the collaboration, efforts to continued access for all students has really been exemplary, and it's been all occurring during an incredibly difficult time for so many in our community who've been negatively impacted by the pandemic, both from an organization and company perspective to the individual employees. I don't think anyone has not been impacted by COVID-19, and yet there's been a lot of great efforts underway. One of the things I wanted to make you aware of is that while many colleges and businesses were shut down in the spring because of the statewide shutdowns, many college store staff remained at their posts, whether physically on campus or in the warehouses or working remotely. Their institutions deemed the stores as essential operations for the campus, supporting the fast transition to remote learning in the spring and summer, and preparing the campus for the fall reopening, whether that's going to be in person, hybrid, or online. This is really particularly true at quarter-based schools. They didn't have sort of the luxury of kind of feeling their ways through the remaining weeks of the spring term and then preparing for the fall. For quarter-based schools, particularly in the West, they were heading into their spring terms right in the middle of the shutdowns. And so for those schools, if we want to look at what's worked and what hasn't, they've sort of been the test cases for many in the community because they've now gone through effectively two new quarters or terms since COVID started. Some stores also remained open to the public with strict safety protocols. So depending on where we are in the country, some stores have remained open during, physical stores have remained open. With respect to course materials, bookstores have had to manage the fall course material adoption process with significant uncertainties and be nimble. They're always being nimble, and there's always uncertainties with the course material adoption process. So in some ways, college stores were much better prepared than many of their colleagues on campus for dealing with the fire drill and the chaos of transitions. The immediate needs of the early months were ensuring students had uninterrupted access to materials, even if in some cases books were left in a dorm room. I have a cousin who was attending school at American University. She was away on spring break like many students. Her textbooks were in her dorm and she was back in California. Thanks to leadership by Vital Source and Red Shelf and other vendors in close collaboration with college stores and the generosity of many publishers, campus stores were able to offer students the option of digital course materials for free in the spring. So that was really, we've never seen anything like that, and really helped alleviate some of the issues that many students and institutions were facing in the spring. College stores have focused on ramping up e-commerce operations with support of shipping partners who helped make it easier for students to return textbooks that were rented. So that was a big issue. So working with UPS and FedEx, we were able to get those books returned back. Many of those were publisher consignment rentals. So it was important to get those materials back and available for students in subsequent terms. There's been other efforts, virtual buybacks, curbside service, lockers and delivery services to dorms, things that we're now seeing commonplace in general retail are also becoming extremely common with college bookstores over the summer and now very much so into the fall. Interestingly, a lot of these efforts are likely to continue beyond COVID, according to some recent survey that we did of our membership. Campus stores are helping scale up inclusive access programs and other digital delivery models. So for schools that had already had inclusive access programs, they were able to, in some ways, transition more quickly and easily to digital online learning than schools that had not yet started inclusive access or other types of digital models. So we've seen a significant ramp up in these programs, as I think many who are attending this are aware. Again, we're trying to navigate various issues with scaling up these programs, making sure the schools stay in compliance with regulatory requirements. So all of those things are playing into a rather very quick increase in looking at ways to deliver course materials as efficiently as possible for remote learning. Finally, colleges have turned to campus stores to help source PPE, thanks to their supply chain expertise and relationships they have with vendors. We've also revamped their operations, so from cap and gown companies, switching from caps and gowns to hospital scrubs and face masks. We've seen a real significant effort from the vendor community and our members in helping source things that schools need that have to compete with lots of different sources or lots of different other retailers and businesses and government to open effectively in the fall. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jay. We have lots of challenges schools and colleges, universities are facing. Jay's going to cover some of those issues relative to budget and some other topics. Thanks.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, here we go. Thank you, Brittany. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. And I'm sorry I could not be on at the outset. I had a call with a client and senior staff. So, but thanks to Brian at BISG. I think it was around this time a year ago that the three of us did a webinar that roughly covered the same topics. And it goes without saying, gee, what a difference a year makes. I think last year, when I talked about trends in education funding, things were rather robust, both on the K-12 side and not so much on the post-secondary, but they weren't bad. Now we're looking, not surprisingly, at a whole different situation. Brittany, do you have the controls for this? Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Today's topics: pandemic impacts on education funding, of which there are many. Education funding outlook for 2020 and 2021. Status of federal stimulus funding, and some market conditions. Next slide. The pandemic and the national economic emergency has led states to cut their budgets for fiscal year 2020 and especially 2021. In terms of 2020, the cuts were significant in some states, but believe it or not, because those appropriations had already been set, I would say at least a third to a half of states did not make deep cuts. On the other hand, there were some deep cuts. Ohio made deep cuts to both post-secondary and K-12 budgets 2020, and they're going to make deep cuts going forward. I'll talk about that in a minute. Why were these necessary? I shouldn't even have that up there. It's stating the obvious, but high levels, sudden, very high levels of unemployment due to the economic shutdown. We got some bad economic numbers at 8:30 this morning, 960,000 Americans filing new claims. Also, the shift to income tax collections from April 15th to July 15th, 42 states followed what the federal did, and that left them without revenue for several months, and they're now just adding up what came in July 15th. There's been reallocations to public health agencies, et cetera, and also the need to balance budgets. There's only one state, I believe, Vermont, that allows its government to run a deficit. Technically, Indiana can do a little bit of it, but the other states, they can't do what the federal government does. They can't run a bunch of red ink. They have to plug holes in other ways. So many states hope to plug holes in their FY 2021 budgets with phase 4 stimulus funding. Next slide, Brittany. State revenue projections are a key indicator of state budget conditions. And revenue, obviously, is tax income, fees on various services, licenses, et cetera. There's a great deal of fees that come in, and every state is different. On June 30th, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities, a nonpartisan group here in DC, projected that state revenue declines will reach 25% in FY 2021 unless Congress provides additional stimulus funding to what it's already put forward. To date, 40 states have projected revenues for 2021, and it's not a pretty picture. And again, these numbers will get worse unless there's more stimulus funding. California, 17% to 21%, and that number they adjusted downward to that level. They built in an assumption that Congress would act this month. Those numbers will go up if Congress doesn't. Colorado, 20%. Hawaii, 24%. Hawaii got just killed, not only because of lack of revenue, but lack of tourism, et cetera. Illinois, Massachusetts, the governor there, Governor Baker, said, this is such a confusing time. I don't know what to estimate. And here's the low number and here's the high number. So he has a range of 9% in there. Next slide, please. However, what's really interesting is that a lot of states, and here's, I guess, maybe 15, have held K-12 flat. They have not had cuts. Some states have. Colorado, 14% cut, Georgia, 10%, Idaho, 5%, et cetera. But many states have not taken actions yet to cut. They're waiting for this phase 4 stimulus. On the other hand, higher education has taken it on the nose. Next slide. California system, 10% cut, which is huge. Rutgers system in New Jersey, 16.5% cut. Georgia system, 14% cut. Ohio public institutions, at least 3.8 or 4%. And it's going to get worse. And these cuts come on top of losses of revenue that institutions took in the spring and summer. They lost tuition monies because they provided tuition refunds. They lost dining, housing. Rich, I don't know whether you want to chime in on any of this, but institutions have really taken it on the chin.
I was just on the beyond the state cuts, the localities too is sort of a big question. What will happen there? And both obviously K-12 schools receive a significant amount of money from localities in most states, and also higher education community colleges receive funding from localities. So localities is another sort of factor in that we'll have to see how that plays out.
And then we have 2022, which will probably be, regardless of what happens with stimulus in 2021, 2022 will probably be a worse year, a more difficult year. And why is that? It's because, and it relates to something that Rich just said, these tend to be 2 or 3 year events. Tax revenues decline and cause budget shortfalls going forward in the following year. This is exactly what happened in the 2008, 2009 recession. So the illustration down there, to make it a little more concrete, tax dollars now funding FY 2021 state programs were generated in 2020. Hence, declining tax collections in 2021 will lead to budget shortfalls in FY 2022. So states, cities, counties, school districts, higher education systems, they will all be affected here going forward. Now, recent stimulus packages. When the economy shut down in mid-March, the federal government began to provide relief and stimulus in 3 packages. The first 2 total, I believe, $108 billion, and this was just the initial little stimulus packages. $108 billion is a lot of money, but nothing compared to phase 3, which I'll get to in a moment. The 108 was directed immediately to testing, public health, unemployment benefits, Medicare increases, and a few other things. The big package came in late March and was signed into law on March 27th. It's phase 3 stimulus package. It's called the CARES Act. $2.2 trillion in relief for individuals, small businesses, industries, public health, a unemployment benefit, federal unemployment benefit of $600 a month, which has been debated a lot over the past several weeks. We'll get to that in a moment. There were $16.2 billion of CARES Act funding allocated to K-12 education. Higher education received 14.25. And Rich, half of that money was emergency grants to students.
That's right. So half of those funds went directly into the hands of students through the colleges, universities. It was a direct-to-student emergency grants. Some of those funds are still being distributed, but most of it's been allocated. It was a very messy process due to changes in regulatory vision and guidance from the Department of Education and some different views of what the statute required, but essentially about half of those funds went out to directly to students. Those students could use those funds for anything, so it could cover the cost of computer, could have covered the cost of course materials, it could have been spent on anything that the student needed as a result of the emergency and result of the loss of jobs, attending schools, etc. So the other half went to the institutions of higher education in a formula, and the use of those funds could be covering payroll, other kinds of costs associated with the impact of COVID and learning. Some of those funds were used to cover shipping costs associated with getting those textbook rental returns back to campuses. So schools did provide, in some cases, free shipping to get those books back. So that helped. There's been other uses of those funds to support students in accessing and receiving their learning materials. So while it's not a huge amount of funds in the scheme of things, it definitely has helped a lot for schools and learning materials to some extent.
Thanks, Rich. And I have mentioned phase 4 stimulus. And the first bullet says this week. Actually, that slide is from a deck I did for clients several weeks ago. Negotiations started late July, early August for the next stimulus package. Frankly, these negotiations between the congressional Democratic leadership and the White House. Negotiations broke down last Friday, the 7th. And then subsequently on the 8th, on Saturday, President Trump issued 4 executive orders to provide, as he said, some sort of temporary relief. One was a order regarding deferral of student loan interest and payments, which is probably the least controversial of the 4 orders. It really just extends something that the CARES Act had done, extends it to December 31st. The other was an order regarding evictions. There was a moratorium in the CARES Act on evictions that went through July 31. The executive order that was issued doesn't really proclaim the or extend the moratorium. It sets up a process by which the federal government would begin to study how to do so without congressional action. A third executive order had to do with payroll tax, not cut, but deferral through the end of the year, which was also fairly controversial. And then finally, the most controversial one has to do with the federal unemployment benefit. President Trump, in his executive order, mandated that the federal benefit of $600 a week, which ran out July 31st, would be reduced to $400, and the states would have to pay $100 of it, meaning that the federal really paid $300. Many states, both Democrat and Republican, are saying that they don't want to pay that $100 benefit and could not pay it. So a lot of this has gotten to be political very quickly, not surprisingly. In terms of what's on the table, phase 4 stimulus, the congressional Democratic leadership proposed a $3 trillion package, which actually House Democrats passed several months ago. Senate Republicans, meanwhile, want to limit the package to $1 trillion. So they're quite a bit apart, $2 trillion apart. Speaker Pelosi has said that she would cut her package down to $2 trillion if the White House went up to $2 trillion, and they would both have $2 trillion, and then they would negotiate the contents of it. The White House said it could not go for a number that high. In terms of education, proposals for K-12 vary from $70 billion to $175 billion, but what the negotiators have settled on is something around $100 billion. Right now it's $105 billion. $70 billion would go to K-12, $30 billion would go to higher ed, and $5 billion would be flexible. In terms of the K-12 funding, 2/3 of that $70 billion, 2/3 is about $46 billion, is contingent upon schools having at least a 50% reopening. Democrats don't like that provision at all. Now, having said that, of all the stuff, of all the things that these negotiators are arguing over, there seems to be more of an agreement at the moment on education. In fact, President Trump said about 3 hours ago that education was something that there seemed to be some agreement on, and that maybe there could be some action on education. In terms of how big this is, $105 billion for education. Rich, if I recall correctly, the ARRA was $100 billion. This was the Obama stimulus package in February 2009. So this is roughly the same size, $5 billion bigger. So that is the current status. Brittany? One thing that is separate and apart from the stimulus is the federal education budget, which the House has approved, the Senate has not. How and when the Senate might do that is very hard to figure out. It'll probably get rolled into a big budget deal sometime this fall or probably after the election. But there's good news here in the House bill in terms of increases for education. And again, this is separate and apart from any stimulus funding. It's a piece of good news in a brief presentation I've given, which is a lot of bad news. Next slide. In terms of what this has done to the market, when I say it, the pandemic, when you look at K-12 instructional materials, and by the way, this is the Association of American Publishers year-to-date net sales, January through May, When you look at the difference with the K-12 number, 489.5 versus 706.5, it's 30.7% decline, which was quite a decline. I don't recall seeing anything that drastic in that short a time period from the last recession in 2008 or 9, although the declines were significant. In terms of higher ed, and Rich, maybe you can explain this number, but somehow higher ed got to 8.9% positive number.
Yeah, I think as the AP noted, and others have, a lot of that was tied to no returns occurring to the publishers, so that helped temporarily boost the bottom line numbers up. I think that's just sort of a unique issue unique issue in this context for higher ed, that most of the inventory was sort of sheltered in place, whether that was in the stores, retailers, or in other warehouses. So until that inventory shakes out, we'll have a better picture after all that shakes out.
Very good. And just a few other comments about market conditions. I've had a number of clients and associates ask me about the state adoption markets. State adoption markets at the moment have seen some postponements. For example, North Carolina has postponed math and reading, ELA, for the time being. Idaho has postponed math and reading. South Carolina has postponed math and social studies. Let me say this. It's not unusual in any adoption calendar under any economic conditions to see some postponements. There's always some postponements and some stuff added. North Carolina in particular said that they were making their postponements because of the pandemic. The other two, well, yes, South Carolina, Idaho, I'm not sure. Right now on paper, the state adoption market looks fairly good, particularly with ELA programs, which publishers like to sell. But right now, this is holding up. I think that a number of state departments of education, state boards of education will make some judgments, obviously, in September, October, and November about whether to proceed with various programs. Also keep in mind that a number of state legislatures are going to come back into session in order to adjust their budgets. They wanted to wait for stimulus. Virginia is coming back into session next Tuesday, August 18th, for about a month. South Carolina, Pennsylvania, New Jersey have already announced special sessions. So with that, Brian, thank you. And I'm sorry I came on half an hour late. Why don't we open it up for questions?
Jay, Brittany, Richard, thank you very much for being part of this. It's a tremendous amount of information, a great deal of it pretty sobering, and a lot to think about. We do have several questions, so maybe we can try to be a little bit shorter in answering, and we can point people to resources. So one was about open education resource. Any sense of the size of the market for paid resources? So people buying printed books, for example, from those sources. Is that something that NACS tracks, or is it evaluated elsewhere?
Just from the survey point, I'll mention that Rich might have other info on the actual full market size, but that would fall a little bit under what I mentioned earlier, where because we're measuring directly from a student doesn't necessarily know if a resource would fall under, open educational resources. In fact, it's very likely they've never heard that term ever. So that's not something we're able to track necessarily via just asking students questions. Rich, I don't know if you have any other info from other sources.
You might add the Faculty Watch data that we have in the Faculty Watch survey.
We do ask faculty about use of OER. I think that it might be this year we've started to look more into like how much of that material is transitioned into like paid formats. I don't think we have past info on that yet.
Yeah, I would just say in general, the perception I have from, following this area pretty closely, and NACS is, we consider ourselves a supporter of open educational resources, and have engaged with various players in the community to support effective deployment and use of OER. We're seeing increased adoptions, but it does tend to be dependent on the institution and where the school is invested or the library is invested into pushing or promoting and marketing open educational resource options for faculty. We've also seen school-wide initiatives such as the zero-cost degree initiatives. Those programs also have suffered a bit under the COVID-19 impact, as some state budgets have been cut, and there's been some pauses on existing state investments, re-upping state investments in zero-cost OER degree programs. So it's kind of a mixed bag. Obviously, with so much remote online learning occurring for this fall, it's an opportunity for faculty, whether they like it or not, to shift towards digital course materials. And that presents an opportunity for open educational resources as well, since sort of their genetic base structure tends to be in digital format, though really OER is mostly a licensing, a copyright licensing regime as opposed to a use regime versus a particular format. So it does present faculty opportunities to consider alternative course materials than they've traditionally adopted.
A comparable question came in about whether or not there are specific subject areas that are more likely to see OER adoption.
Well, I think from an advocacy and community and investment perspective, they've tended to focus more heavily on introductory coursework. So we've seen, you know, some of those, a lot of the focus on physics, biology, sociology, some of those course areas has tended to be where the greater adoption has been. But, you know, OER materials and content can be used anywhere. And but as far as, because so much of the effort has been tied to the affordability discussion, most of the investment and effort has been around those introductory courses, which tend to use more expensive course materials and remedial instruction.
And
I'm sorry.
No,
On the
I'll wait.
level, there's been several reports recently that by far and away mathematics is the subject in which a great deal of OER is produced, particularly if it's OER of a full core program. There's lots of OER that comes into play in English, but it may be bits and pieces. But why is that? Why is it math? Math of the 4 core subjects is easier to put together. ELA has lots of moving parts and lots of different types of students. Science and social studies have other moving parts. It's just that the materials development is more difficult. Math seems to be a little easier, maybe more than a little easier.
Well, BISG and NACS are always looking for good opportunities to work together. It sounds like maybe exploring this might be something we can look at. The question, and I think you've already answered it, is are there subject areas where digital sees the best penetration? It feels like that would parallel the OER discussion that just, you know, that the outline that Jay just provided kind of covers a piece of where digital resources are more common.
At the K-12 level, there's a lot of ELA digital sold as well. Science to some degree, but science, the trend has been more for experiential learning over the past decade or two, taking students out into the field. You may have a lab manual with them rather than a tablet. Social studies materials and programs are one thing that a lot of educators and policy makers kind of scratch their heads about, largely due to just the shifting sands of political opinion in this country and what our social studies textbooks, whether they're print or digital, ought to have. There's some states that have held off on social studies adoption simply because they don't want to get into it. So I'm going far afield here from digital, but I would say that there's a great deal of digital development in all subject levels, but particularly math and ELA.
If I can just go ahead, Brittany.
One thing I would just add to that is not exactly course of study, but we see a lot that it depends on what course within a certain course of study. Students, a lot of times in some of those introductory classes, they're essentially required to get the book. They don't necessarily care as much what's in it. And we see them like digital more in some of those entry level courses, whereas when they're getting into the later levels of their actual course of study that they want to work in, we see more and more students want to keep the book, want to have more physical interaction with the book. So then they start turning more towards print. Whereas for some of those really early classes where, they just have to like check the box and whatnot, they're more likely to just prefer the easy and like simplicity of a digital course material.
Whatever's cheapest.
Yeah, that as well.
That's what he is.
If I can just squeeze in one retail question before we go. One of our members is asking, has there been a growth in on-campus print shops providing materials? Is that something you're tracking? I know it's not in the students side, but.
Well, we still have on-campus printing that comes through a variety of different mechanisms. I can't say there's been an increase. There's a lot of partners in the space, and we're seeing, particularly for OER, we're seeing some of the larger printers in the market doing a lot of that and then distributing. So there's different ways to approach it, but I haven't seen particularly any growth. University presses are particularly challenged also with budget challenges on campuses. But print shops, whether it be on campus, off campus, I think for a lot of folks looking at print, particularly for OER, it's trying to figure out what the best needs are, and that's going to depend on, do they need to do large print runs, smaller print runs, what's the lowest cost? So that's a big factor too, and whether students acquire the print option. So I don't think we have any data on that specifically though.
We have a bunch of questions that I'm sure we could keep you here for another hour, but I promised you that we would just take today a little bit of your time. Brittany in particular, great to have you back, and Jay as well, and thank you for working so hard to set this up. Rich, it's always good to see you, and I hope there's a time in the not too distant future when we get to sit down face to face again.
Yep, excellent, thank you.
Thanks, Brad.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for the folks who are here today. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, Rich.